Welcome to our panel, which is from the newsroom to the workshop. I'm going to read a short introduction just talking about the impetus for this panel and the ideas behind it, and then we're going to be pretty casual and do a sort of round table with questions first that I have for all the panel members, and then questions that you guys might have, if you have them. So my name is Sarah Vereen, and so this panel had its origins in a personal question of mine, and the question, which has been nagging me ever since I left my newsroom desk in Houston and drove 1,000 miles to Iowa City to start my MFA, is why the creative nonfiction world, at least as it exists in academia, is not more welcoming to the journalist and to the influences and lessons of journalism. I think I know why, of course, and that's because journalism has always been considered the antithesis of art. That's what the professor leading my first workshop at Iowa told me, and that's something many of us still tell our students now. Like all binaries, the journalism versus art argument is useful because it helps us define our terms. What is literary writing? Well, for one, it's not journalism. The problem, of course, is that creative nonfiction, unlike other genres, is inseparably linked to journalism. The essay may originate with Montaigne, but creative nonfiction owes much of its contemporary look and feel to the more recent influences of new journalists like Joan Didion, Truman Capote, Norman Mailer, etc. And journalistic practices continue to underpin many of the most celebrated works of creative nonfiction being published today, even if neither the public nor the authors recognize its influences. I recently read On Immunity, a wonderful, wonderful book, but in that, Ulysses at some point talks about, writes briefly about one point about trying to get vaccination information from a government agency and being told by the official who answers the phone that he can't talk to her because he's not cleared to talk to journalists. She's taken aback and writes that she's not a journalist, she's a poet. In later interviews about the book, she's made the same assertion that her book is essayistic but not journalistic. But if we're honest, the work she does in that book is both journalistic and essayistic, as are many of the works that we're all writing today. So those were the theoretical and personal questions that inspired this panel, but the much more practical reason for it was that I wanted to get a bunch of former newspaper journalists together to talk about their personal journeys from the newsroom, which is a really distinct environment, to the workshop, which is also a really distinct environment, quite different. I hope to hear their thoughts on some of the questions that I've raised, but I also really wanted to know about how their background has shaped and influenced them as writers. And I'm hoping, too, that we can also offer some advice to either journalists interested in doing more creative nonfiction work or creative nonfiction writers that are interested in doing more journalistic-based work. As I said, we're going to organize this in a pretty relaxed manner. I'll moderate, and I'm going to start just by introducing each of our panelists. But then I'm going to ask an opening question, which is going to ask them to sort of talk about how they got into journalism and then why they decided to leave. So, our panelist to my left, Harrison Candelaria Fletcher, is the author of Descanso, For My Father, Fragments of a Life. His essays, which won the Colorado Book Award, his essays have appeared in many journals, including New Letters and Fourth Genre. He's a former columnist and feature writer in New Mexico, Colorado, and California, and he teaches in the Virginia Commonwealth University's MFA program. Jennifer Latson, to my right, started her journalism career at a tiny newspaper in the foothills of the Washington Cascades, where as rural reporter, she wrote about missing hikers, injured loggers, and the burgeoning meth industry. She covered crime at the Daily Press of Newburgh News, Virginia, before joining the Houston Chronicle, where she was part of a team of Pulitzer Prize finalists for coverage of Hurricane Ike. She left the paper to earn an MFA in creative nonfiction at the University of New Hampshire, and now freelances as a book reviewer for the Boston Globe and a history writer for Time.com. Her first book, a work of narrative nonfiction about a rare genetic disorder called Williams syndrome, is forthcoming next year, and it's forthcoming from Simon & Schuster. Inara Bergeny launched her journalism career as an intern at at newspapers in Tacoma, Albuquerque, and Washington, D.C., before landing a job as a suburban police reporter for the Oregonian in Portland. She spent the next 13 years there covering everything from murder trials to the creative life of the city, and in 2007 she was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Now a professor of creative writing at creative nonfiction at the University of Iowa, where she also earned her MFA. She is also a winner of the Pushcart Prize and a recipient of the Rana Jaffe Writers Award. Her essays in journalism have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, Tin House, The Atlantic, and Creative Nonfiction, and her first book, a memoir, is forthcoming from Norton. And then I'm just going to introduce myself because it gets awkward when we change it. So, Sarah Breen, I'm talking about myself. Her first job out of college was at a small weekly paper on an island in Florida, where she reported on stolen golf carts, vacationing DuPont airs, and beached whales. Her last reporting job was as a news features reporter for the Houston Chronicle. In her time as a reporter, she was named the Best Investigative and Feature Writer in Texas and was part of a team that won a National Freedom of Information Award. She later got an MFA in creative nonfiction at the University of Iowa and is now finishing a PhD in creative writing and literary translation at Texas Tech University. Her prose and literary translations have appeared in talking about myself, I get chalked up.
Do you want me to
finish for me. I'm just so emotional about myself.
Her prose and literary translations have appeared in such magazines as the Colorado Review, Kenyon Review Online, Fourth Genre, and The Pinch, which awarded her its 2014 Creative Nonfiction Award. Now I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Now that my throat's clear. Okay, so I'd like just to open up, that was our official bio, right? But I'd like us each to maybe start, we can start with Harrison if you don't mind, talking about just our personal story. How did you get into journalism, newspaper journalism, and why did you decide to leave?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming, you guys. Thank you for organizing the panel. Can you hear me? Okay. I came into journalism almost by accident. I wasn't an English major. Growing up, I wasn't much of a reader. Unfortunately, I was raised by an artist's mother who I spent my childhood driving around New Mexico, visiting graveyards and ghost towns and cemetery, abandoned churches, and talking to old people and gathering artifacts, which we would bring home, and my mom would make collages and art with. So I became enchanted by story at a very early age, story and memory and history. And so I was a visual artist until probably almost my senior year in college as an undergrad, when I decided I had to get a job. And my sister, who was a foreign correspondent in China, said, try journalism, because it's like going out every day and talking to people and gathering stories. And like, sounds good to me. So that's how I got in. And like everybody here, I've covered everything from roller skating grandmothers to prison riots to, $1 million state budgets to, Miss October 1975 or whatever. And I've been a journalist for, I want to say 15, 16 years before I left. And when I left, I had been a columnist and I had been a feature writer, and I was writing longer magazine type narratives. And I decided to get my MFA because I wanted to see if I could turn that lens on myself, the lens that we're all so good at describing the outer world. I wanted to see if I could turn that on myself. And I had picked up what then was like a landmark book for me, The Art of the Personal Essay by Philip Lopate, which came out in like 94, I think, when I was finishing up in journalism. So that's how I went in to my MFA experience, and found out that was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. But we can talk about that later.
Hi everyone. I am the daughter and granddaughter of refugees, and so I think from a very early age I was primed to see story as a way in which to access a home that could no longer be reached any other way. My grandparents were both very vivid and incredible storytellers, and they saw sort of their sole mission as kind of keeping the home that they remembered alive. And they obviously saw in me, the rest of the family could care less about some of these stories. In fact, they kind of didn't even want to deal with the trauma. But they could sense in me that I was the kind of person that was interested in that. So I very quickly became kind of the vessel, the person who held all the stories for the family. And I don't know, it just began to play out as an impulse in other parts of my life, to the point that when I was about 8 years old or so, and my parents still have the piece of paper, you're asked to draw, what are you going to be when you grow up? And someone must have given me the word. I wrote reporter. I knew that I was interested in other people's stories. I knew that I enjoyed listening a lot more than I enjoyed kind of being at the center of things. I was, I think also because of my childhood, someone who was always on the periphery, always on the edges, listening a lot more than just kind of charging forward. So I just began to pursue that single-mindedly. I didn't know there were other ways to channel those same impulses. And I, wrote for my school papers. I made an underground paper when there wasn't a school paper. I worked for my high school paper. I learned very quickly, dutifully, that I was going to need to get internships. I did that and was so happy when I found gainful employment right out of college. This was also in the mid-90s, and it was sort of like there were no journalism jobs to be had, so I was so grateful that that worked out for me. And I just threw myself into it. I was always drawn toward feature writing in particular, which I think of very fondly as more like the crazy aunt in the attic in a newsroom. Those were my people. And I had an internship fairly late before I got my first gainful employment that really convinced me that that was the world that I wanted to live in. But the advice I was getting at the time, this was in the style section of the Washington Post, which was just kind of a dream for a feature writer. I sat across from Henry Allen and got to eavesdrop on all his phone calls. Oh my gosh, it was amazing. Anyway, I got advice there. Don't just keep doing verbal pyrotechnics or literary pyrotechnics. Make sure that you prove yourself as someone who has reporting chops. They were saying, maybe you could go straight into a feature writing job, but more than likely the best thing is to pay your dues. So I ended up getting this police reporting job in the suburbs and kind of had no clue what I was doing, and ended up being the most incredible accidental education. And then I bounced around the newsroom a lot after that. That kind of helped me in many, many ways in terms of what's the truth and how do we know it, and also just having sometimes to gut through, writing and not have it be perfect or precious, just get it out. Anyway, they couldn't figure out what to do with me because, like I said, I really belonged with the crazy aunt in the attic folks. And so eventually I got hooked up with an editor at the Oregonian who understood that I was a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. And he was amazing. He was the one that sort of unleashed me on the beat that he called the creative life of the city, which allowed me to write about whatever I wanted. And that came to encompass, for example, a couple who collected so many velvet paintings that they eventually had to open what is now probably the world's only velvet painting museum. Maraschino cherries. Also, though, a man who the only way he could overcome his depression was to turn the upper floor into his home into an aviary. I loved small stories. I loved quiet stories. I worked the city. I mean, the most beautiful part, I think, about daily journalism is the fact that you get to know a city. You know it in terms of a sort of master narrative over years and years and years and years. And then the city starts to know you, which is also a really incredible feeling. After I'd done that for a while, though, I began to feel I was bumping up against the edges of what I could do at the paper. That was also literally simultaneously coinciding with paper shrinking. So I was bumping up against the edges of what I could do. Long form was not considered something that places were wanting to invest in at that time. It was actually what they were cutting back from. And so sensing all those things and sensing that I needed to make a change, I realized maybe what I wanted to do was I wanted to go even more deeply into my writing. I had a lot of people say, well, why go get your MFA? You're already writing. But that wasn't the point. I wanted to I wanted to become a better writer. I didn't want to just keep coasting and doing the same things that I was doing over and over again. I actually really wanted to turn everything upside down. And I did.
I feel like our stories are kind of similar, but very different. So I think I always wanted to be a writer, and when I got into college, can everybody hear me? Okay. I discovered Joan Didion and John McPhee, and I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. And the teacher who taught those authors to me became my mentor, and she said, well, go get a newspaper job because, they'll pay you to write every day. And she's also someone who said, do what you love and the money will follow, which not true in newspapers, but maybe in the long term. So I started, I really didn't have internships under my belt, and I think it's probably telling of this sort of bias against journalism that we didn't even have a journalism program at my school because it was considered a trade, and Yale doesn't think of itself as a trade school. So, so I just went out and got the first job I could get, which was rural reporter. And then, but I was always dreaming of long-form narrative writing, being McPhee or being Didion. And so I kind of just thought, well, if I work my way up and up and up, then at the big papers, that's where you'll get that chance. They'll have the resources. So when I got to the Houston Chronicle, I thought, yeah, I made it. And I'm going to have these great opportunities here. And I started as a GA, and I was just kind of running from fire to homicide to natural disaster. And then I had this idea to pitch a beat. This was in 2008, and I wanted to take advantage of the recession to advance my own agenda. So I said, why don't I have this beat covering the effects of the recession from kind of a human interest standpoint, and write these narratives of people who've been affected, and this is really life-changing. So I got to do one great story about the people who had never been homeless before, who had been sort of middle class and suddenly found themselves with nothing, didn't have family money, didn't have a support network, and were in homeless shelters. So that was a great story, but because I pitched this beat that was sort of a business beat, as far as the editors saw it, I got moved to the business desk, and I had an editor who was not really on the same wavelength as me and didn't like any of my story ideas and really thought I was sort of wasting everybody's time with these features. And so I ended up doing Men's Warehouse quarterly earnings report stories, and that's when I started to really get disgruntled. And I had always thought that an MFA was a big waste of time and money because, you're already writing, and so if you wanted to write better, you could do it on your own time. But then Sarah Vereen left the paper for an MFA program, and I was like, well, if Sarah's doing it, it's probably a great idea. So I started applying probably right after you left, and it turned out to be great. I mean, one of the rules that I made for myself was I won't go anywhere that doesn't give me a TA-ship, because I can't go into debt for this. So that was my restriction. I ended up at the University of New Hampshire, also partly because they had a lot of former journalists on faculty there, and I really wanted to do this literary journalism thing. And that ended up being perfect for me, and I never would have written a book without that kind of support and guidance and just being around fellow writers who are doing the same thing. So I thought it was great, and I'll let Sarah talk.
Okay, I'll be brief because we are echoing each other somewhat. But really, I very much like Inara, I did a lot of, I was on my school paper, and I really loved journalism because I liked meeting people. I'm kind of introverted, but when you're a journalist, you can actually go out and talk to people because you have this sort of front. I studied literature in college, and afterwards I really didn't know what to do with myself, and I befriended a photographer in Sarasota, Florida, at the Sarasota Herald Tribune, and she was very much an artist at heart. She loved art photography, but she also believed she had to have a job, and so she kind of inspired me. I mean, she just loved storytelling, visual storytelling, and written storytelling, and she said, this is where you go. If you want to tell stories, this is what you do. And I was like, okay. But I didn't think about internships either. I had no experience except for my high school newspaper. So that's how I ended up on an island of 1,000 people in Florida, which ended up being the best experience ever because it was this really, really rich mix of communities of like a fishing village with like the DuPonts, right? There's all these really, really rich people. The Bushes would vacation there. And then you had the generations of fishing families. And so I was the only reporter and photographer, and I drove a golf cart around town reporting on crime and various other things. And everybody knew me, of course, because it was such a small island. And I wrote everything, right? I reported everything. But towards the end of my time there, I actually wrote what would be considered a hard-hitting piece for the Boca Beacon, as our paper was called. And it was about a time in the 80s when basically all of the African-American residents had been forced off the island. And I just heard a rumor about that, and I sort of checked it out, and I decided to write this story, and it was true. There had been mostly African-American workers who had worked for the various rich families, and there had been a kind of conspiracy to push them off the island because they wanted the property for more valuable projects. And doing that, like, really sort of it sort of made me realize what journalism could do, right? The importance of it, because that story just wasn't told. And so then I realized I couldn't stay at the Boca Beacon for the rest of my life. So I went to another island in Texas, Galveston, and then eventually ended up at the Houston Chronicle. And I kept thinking too, bigger papers will be better jobs. I'll be able to do that storytelling that I've always wanted to do, and I could. But then when everybody's talked about, the paper started to shrink, and there was a really big turning point for me when on the second round of layoffs at the Houston Chronicle, one of the sort of investigative projects reporters who had been with the paper for a really long time and had leukemia was laid off, and I just realized that this was not an industry that would support me. When I got old. I don't know if academia will either, but also coinciding with this, my GRE scores were about to expire. I'd taken them right after college, and I thought, well, I should apply to grad school, so I did. And so that's my story. So I have some more questions. One sort of theoretical question and a lot more practical questions. My theoretical question for everyone relates to my introduction, which is this idea of journalism, right? What sort of role does journalism have in our field, right? In the field of creative nonfiction. When I said, as I mentioned in my introduction, creative nonfiction is the only genre so closely linked to journalism, and yet journalism is often characterized as an antithesis of art. As we creative nonfiction writers continue to seek recognition of our work as art, how do you think we can do this without also distancing ourselves as journalists or the journalistic aspects of our work? So maybe we'll start with Jenny in the middle.
I mean, I always got offended when people said that journalism was a trade or journalism is not creative, because I think it's just a matter of definition. So, I mean, journalism does include, like, PTA meeting stories and things that are not going to be creative, but good journalism, I think any good newspaper should have those long-form stories and the storytelling stories, or I don't think it's doing its job. So, I just think it's a big enough umbrella for the kind of strictly facts-based reporting and the storytelling, and I think it all just comes down to, are you telling other people's stories? So, Didion, McPhee, Mailer, those are journalists. So, I don't know, I just find that's more of a narrow-minded definition than something that, I need to rebel against.
Thanks. I was do you mind if I ask you guys a question? I'm kind of curious. Are you guys journalists going into MFA programs or MFA products who are thinking about doing more journalistic work? I kind of want to get a sense for journalists.
So option one.
Option one.
Option one mostly. Okay.
Or option two? It's half and half.
Okay.
That was good.
Good mix.
Thank you. That helps. try to gather my thoughts here because I have a lot to say, and it's taken me a long time to get to where I feel about it now. When I first went in from the newsroom to the workshop, I quickly experienced what everybody is saying about journalism is to creative writing, what PR is to journalism. And so after my second semester in a workshop, I began to introduce myself. I'm Harrison Fletcher. I'm a recovering journalist. It's been 2 years since my last byline. Sad but true. I was apologizing for that. It's taken me a long time to realize how damaging that was to me in my writing and the barriers I was creating for myself. But what I think what's happening is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what journalism is and how it is in art form, and I think it comes back to how in these programs in academia we're sometimes more concerned with definitions, with boundaries, than we are with intersections. And I was going to read a quote from Michael Martone, who I love and I think is important to this. He says, "I'm worried that we don't worry enough about the subliminal influences of sorting, categorizing, and defining. We worry about the categories of fiction and nonfiction, prose and poetry. What we don't worry well enough is about the category of category, the genre of genre." And I fell into that in my transition from the newsroom to the workshop. I was focused on how everything was different, how journalism is different than essay, that is different than lyric essay, that is different than memoir, as opposed to where they come together. And it wasn't until I started seeing the similarities between the forms that I owned up to what I could do as a journalist, which turned out to be quite a lot. And I think in a nutshell, journalism is about rendering the outer world in a lifelike, realistic way, where the writer is not necessarily the focus, but is the guide, and which is very different than personal essay. But it's just a very different skill that's can be applied to all these different forms of nonfiction that I can talk about later. But I'm having my personal essay students and memoir students try and do what journalists do, what Jimmy Breslin does, which is to render the outside world and to shape the outer world, where the narrative eye is not the focal point. And they're having a hard time doing it. And they say it's really hard, and they are learning a lot, and they're stretching themselves in ways that I was stretched in the other way. So I guess that's a long, rambling way of saying that in these programs, I think we emphasize boundaries more than we probably should. So.
I'm going to come at this by saying that I had my mind blown when I showed up at my MFA program. I considered myself fairly well-read within my field. And I realized very quickly what an intensely narrow band that was. The first sort of lyric essay I encountered, it was just this kind of fantastic little bit of dynamite going off. And what became interesting for me was actually to note those places where I felt my own mind blown, but then to realize the ways in which so many of these impulses were shared and were similar. I began to chart who my kin were, my cousins, right? Who else crawled out of the same swamp? And that led me, for example, to the documentary poets. I was like, why in the world were we not taught Charles Reznikoff and Muriel Rukeyser in J school? That made no sense to me. What became interesting for me was realizing that in some ways, I'm much more interested in talking about the impulses that drive one toward an investigation of the world, like journalism or like documentary. I feel like when I talk about it that way, it just feels more inclusive to me. And I like talking about it that way because I feel like then I can also recruit people over who have maybe been a little bit hesitant, I don't know why, about the journalist side, that I can say, but look, what you're doing, that desire to go out and to witness, that is shared. That is springing from the exact same place. This is not a question of hostility or lines drawn. The other thing that I found very helpful was to begin to try to, every chance I got, to talk about art, or to talk about the art of process. I felt like that helped a great deal. And it helped me too, to really appreciate the side of getting, right, this information as being an art in and of itself. I remember there being a conversation in a workshop, and there was a real reason why process should have been discussed, and instead everything kept coming back to craft. And in essence, it felt like the unsaid thing in this discussion was that how the information was, sort of unearthed didn't matter. And I just suddenly had a list of like 5,000 counter arguments in my head where, I would say like the process of getting random family is art. That's incredible. It's extraordinary. I don't know why we accept in other art forms, we accept constraint-based art. That's totally understood, for example, in visual art or in conceptual art. Why do we not appreciate constraint-based art on the side of creative nonfiction? That's in essence what we're talking about. In some cases, people are saying, here are the constraints that I've chosen to work within. And that's important to acknowledge and understand in the understanding of the art. Then that process also becomes an important overlay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to piggyback on something she said about process. One thing that I just recently read, Tom Wolfe, we're doing something in my class about new journalism, but Tom Wolfe said that the thing that was revolutionary about new journalism, a lot of people think it's the pyrotechnic writing. He said it was the reporting that was revolutionary. It was that the things that they were doing could not have been done without the reporting, which is to immerse yourself in another experience and gather novelistic details and to render them in a way to make a story. That is something that is an art form. The reporting is an art form, and not an easy one to acquire either. So, that is something that the students and the personal essayists find really helpful and really challenging because it's not as easy as it seems. So anyway, I just wanted to echo that. The process is really important, and that's what made the new journalists, that's what made them the artists that they were, was the reporting and the gathering of those details.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that being a distinction, and there are big distinctions that you think about in this transition from the newsroom to the workshop, but definitely the lack of focus on process. I hadn't thought of that. So the next question I had for everyone was sort of two questions. One is how, some of us have started to answer this, but how being a journalist influenced or even aided you as a writer. But then also, were there any ways in which it might have hindered you, especially early on? And I'll start by answering this. I definitely think what a lot of us have mentioned is that just having the skills, the sort of, for me, having the confidence to go and be able to talk to people. I noticed among my peers in the MFA world that a lot of people, if they wanted to do something more journalistic, were really timid, right? Because it's nerve-wracking to have to talk to a stranger. But after doing that for so many years, daily, I think I have gotten immune to that sort of intimidation. And that's a huge help whenever I've done work that's more looking out rather than inward. As far as hindering, this is actually trying to go back to journalistic work after writing more personal essays. One reason I wanted to leave journalism was what some other people have mentioned, is that I wanted the I of my work to exist. I think that was really hard for me in newspaper journalism, is that you don't really exist, right? You're not supposed to exist unless you're doing working as a columnist. And I felt, I'm opinionated. I have lots of opinions, and they felt muted. And so I just loved starting to write personal essays, or even journalistic work in which my sort of personal I would play a role. But as I did that, I started to write more and more personal essays, and they would be published online, and they're often revealing of who I am, right? And so I'm a lesbian, and I have a daughter, and I now live in West Texas. And I say all that because I recently was starting to work on a piece about a murder, a woman who had been murdered in Lubbock. And I was trying to get information about that, and I had contacted a man who I guess had been involved in the case for a very long time. And he had all sorts of information about it, and I had been given his contact from someone else, and I emailed him and asked if we could get together, and he said, yes, of course. And then he wrote me back a few minutes later, and he said, hold on, I'm looking you up. And then I wrote him back, and I said, well, I'd be glad to give you references if you need references about my journalistic background, because he was a journalist as well. Much older, he was a local reporter from Lubbock. And he eventually wrote me back, and he said, no, I don't want to talk to you. And I can only assume it's because of the personal essays I've written, right? That he had sort of political opposition or moral, whatever, to who I am. And that who I am, before when I was a journalist, it was muted, right? It was never there. But now that I'm a creative writer and a personal essayist, that is part of who I am as a writer. And so that was really jarring, but I think important. I like that. I like feeling more integral as a writer, and feeling like who I am is also part of the work I do. So.
Wow. I was going to say the same thing about the confidence that journalism builds, because I'm also an introvert, and so I think what Sarah said about having reporting be your kind of facade is so true, because I am really shy, and I would never ask, I think it's very rude to ask someone personal information, and then on the job, I'm like, and so, how old are you? What do you weigh? Those kind of things.
And also, in your bathroom cabinets.
Right, yeah. Tell me about your mental illness, or, what did it feel like when your son died? So those are things that I can ask now after years of just beating back that fear, and but I still can't return a dish at a restaurant. That's just too much. So it's just a personal and the professional are different. But that even now, if I'm doing something for myself or just freelancing, it's I can still put that cloak on and just say, well, I'm in journalist mode now, and I can do this. And other things, just writing fast. It makes you really fast. It makes you organized. Makes you meticulous about accuracy, and so those things I think are great skills to have that are going to get drilled into you. And then on the flip side, it's hard to get out of some of those habits. So I think even now I'm haunted by, I constantly want to attribute everything, and that's not really appropriate in a lot of creative nonfiction. But I just I've always had editors be like, well, who said this? Where'd you get this number? So that haunts me. And it's sad because I was recently cleaning out my parents' basement to help them move, and I found some stories that I had written in high school, and then some of my college essays, and my voice, I feel was so strong back then, and then I feel it took me a while. I think at the MFA program I got back into my own voice, but it really, I had to unlearn all these things I had learned, so that was very difficult. And then finally, I just want to say, what Sarah was saying about kind of bringing the I into things, I don't think that takes away from journalism, and in some ways it makes it more honest, right? Because we all come to all stories with our own background and agenda, and so I kind of love when writers put the I in, and I think maybe that's happening more now, even in traditional journalism, that people kind of say, here's where I come from on this story, and I think that's great. But I haven't really thought about the drawback is when you put yourself out there, you're vulnerable. So but that is shocking.
I'm gonna quickly form the things that I thought were advantages that I came in with as a helpful list of maybe to-dos for everybody out here that you can hack and use too. one of the things was definitely learning that even if you try to approach someone and maybe you don't get a great interview out of them, everyone is always 1 or 2 degrees from a storyteller. So I learned that, I brought that with me. Maybe that person you sort of strike out with, they give you monosyllabic answers no matter what you try to do. But guaranteed they are 1 or 2 degrees away from someone else in their life who can speak in narrative terms in a beautiful way to animate your story. The other thing that I came in with that I learned is no means not now. And by that I mean you have a story that you're desperate to do and you come up against roadblocks. Someone says, no, no thank you. Okay, but that means no right now. You can come back to that person, you can take some time, you can reconsider maybe what it was that was making them say no. Things soften with time. I learned that sometimes the best thing to do is to show up on someone's doorstep or is to sit unannounced in their office. I also learned that one of the other great things that you can do is send someone a letter. Sometimes calling someone or emailing someone, it just feels weird and intrusive, but to send someone a letter returns some control to them and lets them feel as though they have choice in doing it. Historical societies are your friends. Same thing with special archives at universities. And sometimes you just have to race past your internal censor. I had an editor who gave me a little quote that said something like, writing on deadline is like riding a bicycle on a tightrope. You just have to pedal like hell. And it's not particularly profound, but damn, it worked. And so sometimes you've got to do that. That's it. You just have to crank it out. Even when you think you're doing art, you just have to crank it out. And finally, actually, I will say, one of the things that was so critical for me, I was just telling someone this morning, the Oregonian was one of the very first newspapers in the country. In fact, the New York Times wrote a story about it to include reporters' emails and phone numbers on every single thing they wrote. So this was sort of in pre-internet comment days. For a while, they even had our addresses, like the address where you could send the letter to the editor and the fax number. And all the reporters were belled because they were like, that's 1 more inch off my story. Like, let's get rid of that. But so I was always used to hearing from people all the time about what I wrote. I always knew that everything I wrote was for public consumption. I was very used to heavy breathing calls, I called them. The people who usually called in the middle of the night and used that as an excuse to say that I or my family should die or to say very hateful, horrible things. I got used to that. And so when I went to an MFA program, one of the things immediately that I vowed was that I was just going to work in a bubble. After years and years of doing that, I didn't want to even think about my work being published. I just wanted to do it like fidelity to story. That's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do it so that I could do the best thing that this project deserved. But I think that what was important was, all the while, I still had that sense of what it means to put your work out in the world and the toughness that requires if you believe in it enough. And I think it's good to practice that. It's good to both protect yourself in the bubble, but it's also good to practice and think about it, right? Being out there and why that matters to you, and why you're willing to risk the heavy breathing calls in the middle of the night for it. Finally, the last thing I'll just say is that the recovering journalist is always the journalist who really struggles with I. I was always getting called out to the woodshed at the paper because I was too present in my stories. And I never did really use the I. I instead would do things that I saw as deeply brilliant at the time. I mentioned this last night at my reading, where I would use second person, like, whoa, I was really, really smart. I dodged them. And still I get called down to the executive editor's office. You're too present in your stories. Then I show up for my MFA program, and the question always in workshop, I could just anticipate it. Where are you? Mm-hmm. Where are you? Even when I would be in there. And it just, that became in some ways my eternal struggle. And I still think it is to a degree. I think there was something about that experience that so caved off my eye that I think I may just always be a little bit more on the omniscient side of things.
Some of us have bigger eyes than others.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. I want to be repetitive, so I won't. But just listening to, what did I bring to the MFA program from journalism? Everything that everybody said. But listening to Inara now, it was like, the thing that has helped me the most is to be persistent. And what I mean by that is what she was talking about. The lengths that you go to get a story, to get what you need in the newsroom, are absolutely applicable to how you chase down what you need to chase down in an essay. And it may seem like a corny or cliche moment, but the turning point for me in my MFA program was when an advisor said, you have all these skills, you have all these things you can do, now just turn that lens on yourself. And what that meant to me was, be as persistent with your own material as you are with the source. What I mean by that, don't let the Dick Cheneys inside yourself evade an answer. Or if you're writing memoir about a personal experience, slip under the crime scene tape. Get inside your own censors, your own evasive barriers that you put up. So use those skills that you have as a reporter and just turn them on yourself. And that really helped me. And he said, when you're trying to write yourself on the page, you're trying to be more present as an artist, where are you on the page? You're not present on the page. He told me, observe yourself as carefully as you would your subject of a profile. What are those intimate details that you have been trained to see in others? Look for those in yourself. You know how your body processes emotion, for example. Those tics that you have. Pay attention to that when you're writing yourself as a character on the page. And that really helped me, because I really struggled with it a lot, and still do. Even though I was a columnist, I was one of those columnists where it wasn't about me. I think Brian Doyle said that yesterday. It was never about me. It was always I was always trying to introduce people to places or situations where they may not normally go. And so I was trying to persuade through illustration or make an argument by showing people. So I was never comfortable, and still I'm not, about being, so upfront on the page. And I struggled with that, and I tried to barrel through it in my, early attempts at essay and memoir, and it was pretty awkward, I got to admit. But then I, used another journalistic technique where you do a little bit of jujitsu almost, and you turn that negative into a positive. And so I found that, it just never really felt right for me to be the focal point of the work that I do. So how could that work for me? So I've learned how to write indirectly in my creative work in a way that's persuasive. And what I mean by that is, as journalists, we're all used to gathering information and presenting it to convey some information or a story. So I use those skills to write lyric essay or collage essay, where the narrative eye isn't so much the guide on the page, but it's how your presence as a writer is felt in how you arrange information and present it to the reader, and let the reader make meaning with you. And I found out, I'm actually really good at that, because I've done that all my life as a journalist. So I tried to use the skills that I had to write indirectly and apply to a creative work. So that's kind of how I managed to make the transition, is to realize that there was no transition from the workshop to the newsroom. The newsroom is a workshop to me. It just is. And it's like that kid from The Matrix, that moment where he's sitting in the living room of the Oracle, where he said, please don't try and bend the spoon, it's impossible. The answer is realize that there is no spoon. And the barriers you're creating, the distinctions that they're bringing up in workshop, are only there to the extent that you make them barriers. So I'll stop.
That's great. So you guys have already started to answer what I think will be our last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, which was about Harrison had asked who are the people here, right? Are you journalists who are interested in doing more creative nonfiction or creative nonfiction nerds who are interested in doing a work that's journalistic. And so I'd asked, I wanted to ask our panelists like what advice you have for both those groups. And you guys sort of started to answer that already. I'll answer, and then we can, if you guys think of more things, we can come back to you. I think for those that are interested in doing journalism work, right, that maybe don't have the background or training, one thing I would say is that just to always call as many people as you can, even if you think they don't want to talk to you. I just was writing something about prairie dogs the other day, and I saw this video of a woman who relocates. She's a prairie dog relocator. And I immediately called her, right? And she was great. I mean, she was just fabulous. And then I, called the city. I just called all these people who had all these relationships with prairie dogs. And then when I was able to write, became much richer, right? And I think that's my journalistic background because I just thought, okay, I'm interested. I'm going to call these people. But I think sometimes that's not your instinct, if that's not your background, but it's a good thing to do, right? Because those people usually love to talk to you. And if they don't, it's not going to be a big thing if somebody hangs up on you, right? It's not going to be the end of the world. And then the other thing is just something journalists do a lot, especially if you're sort of general interest or features. I did a lot of news features, is you're always looking for stories. And I think that stuck with me. Just to have, now there's like Google alerts, so you can, Google alert whatever information you want, but just reading really small town newspapers. I'm teaching a true crime course, creative nonfiction course right now, and I'm having my students write it's a literature course, but they have to write a creative work, and I'm having them read small town newspapers, right? Small crime coverage from small town newspapers. And I think that sort of daily practice or weekly practice of sort of checking in on potential stories everywhere is really great. It might not even be something you plan to write about, but then you just get so fascinated by it. So those are a couple of pieces of advice I have for those interested in journalism. For those who are journalists interested in creative nonfiction, I think the thing that I wish somebody had told me was that I think that I thought when I went to the workshop that people would think journalism is as cool as I think it is, and they didn't. And it just took me a really long time to get over that. I was like, why don't you guys think newspaper? I mean, that's all I wanted to be, was like a features writer at a, Oregonian or the St. Pete Times. I grew up in Florida. It was really great.
Writer's name.
Right. And so it was sort of shocking. It took me a while to get a thick skin about it and to realize that I was proud of who I was. And so my advice would be proud of who you are. Really, I mean, there's so many skills you have, and so much you've learned being a journalist. So those are my thoughts and advice.
I would say too, for journalists going to MFA programs, it is hard, and like Harrison said, like turning that lens inward or doing these different forums, especially after you've had this drilled into you over so many years, like this is the right way to do it for a newspaper, it's hard. So I say go all in. I mean, it took me really like my first year of the MFA program, I really wasn't breaking out of that journalism shell, and it really took a lot of just forcing myself to experiment, forcing myself to try new things. And I'm not good at writing lyric essays. They're terrible, but having done that makes me better. Like I take some of what I'm okay at in those, and then it makes my literary journalism stronger. And the best thing I did in MFA school was take a fiction writing class. And I really, I think I've lost whatever skill I may have once had to like imagine things that are not true. So fiction was really hard for me, and staring at the blank page was really hard, to the point that, I only came up for workshop twice in that semester. And both times I just took things that had happened in my real life and changed names, really was all I did, which I kind of suspect happens a lot in fiction. But so I was trying to think, like, what's the most dramatic story that I can think of that really happened, because I can't imagine anything. And so I told this story of something I did as a 16-year-old that I am deeply embarrassed of and have never told most people in my life, and still haven't. But I wrote it as fiction, just changed the name, literally just changed my best friend's name. And it went over great in fiction workshop. And so I was like, well, you know what I'll do is I'll just change these names back and then submit it as creative nonfiction, because that's what it was. But I think thinking of it as fiction had made me really, I built suspense and I did all these things that you should do in good creative nonfiction. So then I submitted that to literary journals and I got it published. And I just never told my friends and family because they're not going to read a literary journal. So I'm totally safe.
The joy of having a small audience.
Yeah.
If you guys have anything to add.
Yeah, just a couple of quick tips. That I was going to say that I think this is mostly if you're interested in maybe doing more in terms of journalism, bringing that more into your creative writing work. One thing that happened to all of us as a result of having to be in a newsroom is that any day you could walk in, and if you saw like the city desk editor like sort of scope you right from across the room, you just like have grabbed your coffee and barely gotten in the door. You're like, oh shit, something's happened. I'm going to be sent out on like, the triple homicide or, huge fire or something. And you just had to be ready and just accept that you were going to be thrown into the big story, right? That you were capable of the biggest thing that could be thrown at you. One of the things that I've noticed in MFA programs for people who don't come out of a journalism background is that sometimes there seems to be a tendency to wait for things to come to you, to wait for inspiration, to not see yourself as like the person who could do the big story. A lot of times people write kind of, they're beautiful and small and quiet, but it almost seems like people holding back from accepting that their gifts are capable of that big story. Write about big things, write about ambitious things. Like, throw yourself into it. Be the city desk editor for yourself, to throw yourself into that big thing that you want to think that you're capable of doing but are afraid of. We just had to choke back our fear. I mean, I have stories about fear and nausea and crying on the way home, but that was the type that's good for you. So.
Yeah, great. I agree with that completely. My advice is going to be kind of corny too, so I'll just say that up front. But I guess for me, for a journalist going into the workshop, so this would be the advice from a journalist going to the workshop, is to really understand what it means when somebody says, yes, you can. And what I mean by that is that as a reporter, you're hearing no so much. Or if you're trying to push the boundaries of writing, you hear no, you can't, or we can't do it that way, take it, And then when you get to the creative world, just realize how much freedom you do have. And it's an interesting experience. It can be a transformative experience when the shackles are off. When I was allowed to imagine or speculate, it was like Star Trek fans out there, it was like when Data got his emotion chip. It's like I didn't know how to turn it off, but it was like transformative for me. So it's important to take advantage of that in a workshop where it's like, well, yes, you can write. Yes, you can explore where you think the story needs to go. And for the creative writer going into the journalistic world, one of the most important things that I brought with me from journalism to the creative writing teaching world is the ability to listen. And that has been invaluable in everything that I've done. And so for the creative writer to go into the journalistic world, just take advantage of the opportunity to just sit and listen and absorb the environment and what people are telling you. That's a skill too. But I think that's when you're an essayist or a memoirist, you're in the driver's seat. So you're driving the material, but in the journalistic world, as we all know, it's about the other person. So just to take advantage of what listening can do. And one last thing, when Nanara said, don't wait for inspiration to happen. That's absolutely true. But in creative writing, I'm also proponent of this is to allow yourself some quiet space to listen to yourself. What I mean by that is when you're writing, don't try to force things. You don't have to do that as much as in creative writing as you do in journalism, but just to listen to what your subconscious or what your unconscious is telling you. And that's a skill, to just be still with the material that you're writing about and see what surfaces on its own without going in and trying to make it into something. Does that make sense? So I think listening is a really important skill that I learned as a journalist that has helped me as a teacher and a writer of so many different forms. Listen to others, but listen to yourself too, and your own process of writing. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 13 minutes. Does anyone have questions?
So I have a sort of a self-serving question.
Those are always the best.
Okay, so I have a daughter who's a senior in high school and discovered a talent for journalism, and she's the editor of her school paper this year. And the writer side of me is like, yay, this is such a good experience, and you're so good at it, and this is so great. And the parent part of me is like, but I want you to have a good job. And I really, I mean, all of you left journalism, so I mean, you have a good biased perspective in that regard. But I'm just kind of wondering on your take about, you know, do you advise a senior in high school to go into journalism? It kind of depends on where she gets accepted, whether she's going to like major in that or major in something more broad. But any advice? Not that she will necessarily take it, but it might
Sure, I have a daughter too.
Okay.
I have daughters. As someone who has a daughter who's, I don't know if she has journalistic leanings yet, but I just think that there are so many things that you learn as a journalist that can be translated into any kind of skill that you have. I mean, you're problem solving every day, you know, and that you're fast on your feet, you're thinking critically, you're thinking creatively, you're processing information quickly and clearly and presenting it in a way that people can understand. There are so many things that you can apply that to. Like as a teaching, I didn't realize that, you know, I don't have a teaching background. I wasn't, you know, English major or anything like that. But being a reporter has helped me so much as a teacher because of all those skills. I mean, so, and journalism, as we all know, is also evolving. So we don't probably know what it's going to look like, you know, in the next 5 years. But this, I would say that the skills that she learns, you know, in the newsroom can be applied to many different things. And so I think that's a, you know, could be a valuable background to have going to the job market.
There are so many colleagues of mine who have also left the paper. I'm like one of the few that actually went this route. For the most part, they all now run the city and the county. I'm not joking. They like have taken up all of those jobs because of the skills that they had as journalists. So I feel like, I mean, part of me is like, if her passion is there, let her have a whirl. And then whatever she's got, she's going to be able to use to turn into probably a much better paying career very quickly. I just was talking with a friend the other day, though, and she was emphasizing that she's on the board of Squill and Scroll, which is the, I can't even talk anymore. Quill and Scroll, which is the National Journalistic Honor Society. And she was saying that there's this recognition that newsrooms now are really driven by multimedia, and that's actually like there's interest in like tech companies and in those sorts of folks in the skills that journalists have as a result of working in multimedia and newsrooms. So it's a lot more fluid world than it ever used to be.
Other questions? Yes, and then there's one in the back. So.
Mine's really more of a comment. I just want to thank you for putting this panel together. I have written 6 books, 2 biographies, 2 company histories, and 2 children's picture books, all non-fiction. And coming to this, and I've never written a personal essay, which I feel like I've done by people. I've done a lot of, oral history, sitting down with older people and just spending 2 hours with them, and they just tell their story, and then you're weaving all that into the story of the person and the subject I'm working on. So all of the things you've said really resonate with me, and I sort of it's counterbalanced the telling a true story in a way that's borrowing some of the literary tools from fiction. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's one reason I wanted to do this panel is that sometimes it feels like our elk don't have as much as a presence at some of these, and I don't think that's because there's not interest. It's just sometimes, you know, you have to be here, be visible. I think there was a question back there. Yeah.
So I'm just kind of straddling